Hi there everybody. Ever since last March when we first went into lockdown, we've been doing Music Tuesdays where we've shared our interest in music, talked about the songs and the records and the albums that we love. And all the way through that you'll have heard me talking about my particular love of music. And I thought what would be quite a nice thing to do before the return of Music Tuesday tonight, the first one of the new year, is I talk a little bit more about some of the records, some of the albums that have had a big influence on my love of music, and tell you a little bit about some of them. One of the things that I really like to do with my music is that if I like a band or I like a musician, I like to understand the music that influenced them, the things that they were listening to before they started writing their own music and that sort of thing. So just for the next sort of 15 minutes or so, I'm just going to talk you through some of the albums, if you like, that have been a big influence on me, and you'll have heard me talk about most of them during our Music Tuesdays. So I'm going to start with an Oxford band. I'm going to start with Radiohead. This was their second album, The Bends. It was the follow-up to Pablo Honey, released in 1995, and I guess at that time, the height of Britpop and all of that sort of thing, Radiohead were something quite different. There was something about their style, particularly the lead singer Tom York's style. They were quite there was a lot of melancholy. There was a lot of sort of sadness, I guess, and the band were known, I guess, for their very downbeat approach to some of their songs, but I don't think that's true. I actually think Radiohead were a very, very sincere rock band. This album is noted, The Bends, as the name of the album, is noted for the song Creep, which was on the Pablo Honey album. And the band were really concerned that they would get branded as the Creep Band. So this album was really about changing some of their sort of songwriting style, their lyrical style, and they achieved that. And the standout song on here for me is a song called Fake Plastic Trees, which was a sort of a reflection on 1980s England and that sort of transition, if you like, into a different decade. But Radiohead, The Bends, very, very iconic album cover, and as I say, this was the album that Radiohead really needed to write because they were known around the world for that song, The Creep, which was on the Pablo Honey album, as I said, and they took themselves off to New York and were really horrified that everywhere they went, people only wanted to listen to that one song. So this was a change of direction, I think, for the band. I think this really does mark them down as a great rock band, to be honest. So that's the first one. At the start of lockdown, I wanted to explore further, if you like, the sorts of music that were extremely influential to two big bands that I love, Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin particularly. And I thought, well, you know, what can I do during lockdown as a sort of a hobby? And so I decided to explore the music of the blues. And its history, if you like, going down into the deep south of America, the Mississippi Delta, and that movement of blues music up through North America to Chicago, where, again, you know, you saw that transition from the blues of the deep south to a much more sort of hardened jazz based blues once it reached Chicago. So I could have picked out many albums that I've bought over the last year or so that's helped me develop a better understanding of blues music. But I'm gonna just pick this one album out by an artist called Jimmy Reed. Jimmy Reed was born in Mississippi and eventually moved to Chicago. He was born in 1925 and he died in 1976. And Reed, both the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin have both cited Jimmy Reed as the big influences on their early songwriting. Rolling Stones actually recorded Jimmy Reed tracks on their early albums. This album was recorded was produced in 1963, and as you can see on the album cover, it says mono. So it was recorded before even stereo was produced. But I think it really sort of introduces the style of Reed, the ability that he had as a singer-songwriter. And of course, this was a time when black music in America, it wasn't easy to get it recorded in the 40s and 50s when these guys were first recording their albums. So I think this is an album that when you listen to it, it takes you on that complete blues journey all the way from the Mississippi Delta all the way up to Chicago in the north of America, and that complete sort of influence that blues music has had on a lot of music since, particularly the sort of transition into the music of the Stones, Led Zeppelin, many other bands along the way as well. So the next album I want to talk about is an absolute classic as far as I'm concerned. This album is The Who Live at Leeds, and these are all albums that I've listened to a lot over lockdown. This album was recorded in 1970 in the refectory of Leeds University, and it's actually considered by most of the main critics, the Rolling Stone magazine, Billboard, NME, all those, as probably the greatest live album ever recorded. And I think it's a stunning album. It was recorded by the original Who lineup, it's just got something about it. It's raw. Its production it's not overproduced. But one of the things I like about vinyl records, and this one's just in a brown paper bag, really, is often the album artwork and the stuff that comes with it. Now, this is an original pressing of this album, and it contains some really brilliant material that was produced and issued by the band as part of the production. So you've got, these are all obviously copies, but you've got the stage notes and band stuff and all the sorts of bits and pieces about, this one's about the pyrotechnics. It's the receipt for the pyrotechnics that the band used live on stage. It's quite rare to be able to get these with the complete inserts now, but classic Who, of course, poster, classic iconic The Who, which of course is brilliant. So all of these things, add, I think, to the sort of style, and this one, when I was able to buy this album, it was absolutely brilliant because it had every single additional insert that the band included in that. So for me, I mean, this, if you want to, I think this album captures the if you like, the sort of intensity of the Who's live performances, which of course, following the death of Keith Moon, I think something was lost from the band, some of the energy in that. So for me, that's another great album. The next one is the 1971 album by the Rolling Stones. This is called Sticky Fingers. Number one album in both the US and the UK. This is not an original of that album. The original album cover was designed by Andy Warhol, and actually it did have an actual zipper that you could pull down and reveal the guy's underpants below. There was a lot of criticism of the album cover when it first came out, because of its sort of provocative and suggestive nature. People generally believe that that's a photograph of Mick Jagger's groin and thighs. It's actually not. It was a model that Warhol employed. But a great album. To get an original of that album with the actual fabric sleeve and the zipper and everything else, I mean, you're talking a lot of money. This was a reprint of the album, but nevertheless, you could choose any number of Rolling Stones albums, but I think this one probably, in my opinion, is right up there with the best of their recordings. So that's another significant album. I started really, I guess, listening to music intensely in the late 1970s. Like a lot of people, I was introduced to it in two ways, really. What my friends and that were listening to, if you like, at parties and at home, but also obviously John Peel, who perhaps was one of the biggest influences of people's musical tastes through the 70s, 80s, 90s before his sad death. And I found myself, I guess, in that period where I was taking, they were called O-levels in those days, and CSEs, of course. But in that sort of summer that I was taking my O-levels, I had a lot of time to sort of be on my own, and I just sort of basically went round jumble sales and sort of second-hand shops in those days, just buying any records that I could lay my hands on, just simply to listen to them. That's when I first found myself listening to Bob Dylan. This is, I think, probably Dylan's greatest album, greatest piece of work. It's called Blood on the Tracks. It was released in 1975. And I think it's probably considered by nearly all of the music sort of world really as Dylan's best album. And it was voted by the Rolling Stone magazine, the American music magazine, as the 10th greatest album and most influential album of all time. So this by this stage, 1975, this was Dylan's actually his 15th studio album. I mean, he's very, very prolific. And I don't think you can pick a particular track off the album that isn't just, you know, beautifully written lyrically and set in context in terms of, you know, Dylan's sort of social commentary of particularly life in the US. But my favourite track on the album is the song "Shelter from the Storm," which I think is absolutely beautiful. So Dylan was a massive influence on my musical taste, and I think my sort of journey into music. And very often for me, you know, when I've got a quiet moment, it's most likely going to be you know, one of three artists that I would go to and pull an album out and listen to it, and Dylan would definitely be one of those. So again, you know, Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks, huge influence on me over the years. Right, the next album is probably, well, certainly probably the most iconic album cover of all time, and definitely one of the most iconic pieces of work any band has ever produced, really. And I'm talking about Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, released in 1973. I think I first heard it around 1978, 79, the summer of that year. I listened to a lot of music during that summer. Again, this is not an original of the album, but again, you know, if you lay your hands on an original of the album, first pressing, I mean, you're talking a lot of money. Certainly, I think probably even Floyd themselves would say it was probably their best piece of work. The background to the album was it was at a time when the band had been touring endlessly. There was a lot of pressure inside the band. Syd Barrett, one of the original members, the lead singer of the band, had left the band and was struggling with his own mental health issues. The band themselves were stressed out, and the album really is probably a homage to mental health, and the sort of songs themselves reflect a lot of emotion, a lot of feelings around how the band were feeling at the time. But it's an incredible piece of work, and though there are five songs on each side of the album, they are continuous pieces of work. There's no breaks between the songs, and the cover. I mean, I think there's nothing that can be said about the cover. It probably is the most iconic album cover of all time. Designed by a guy called Storm Thorgerson, very well known in the music business for album design. And the band just simply said to him, we want something simple, but something very stark. And the prism with the rainbow coming out of it is probably one of the most recognisable symbols of the music world, I would have said. But a beautiful album from 1973. Actually, originally, when they were recording the album, another band, a band called Medicine Head, actually released an album in 1972, the year before this was released, called Dark Side of the Moon. And Pink Floyd almost called this album Eclipse, but they didn't. They stuck with Dark Side of the Moon when it came out, and the rest is history. But yeah, it was almost called Eclipse. So that's Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. My next one is a musician who I think, even today, is not necessarily recognised for his genius, but I actually think the guy was a singer-songwriter of such genius that you could easily put him up there with the other people like Dylan, recognised probably as the world's greatest singer-songwriter. I actually think Cat Stevens, as he was known then, was one of those brilliant musicians. This album's from 1970. It's called Tea for the Tillerman. Probably contains a number of Cat Stevens' best known songs, Father and Son, Wild World, Where Do the Children Play, all feature on this album. Rolling Stone magazine placed it in the top 500 albums of all time. High up, I think it was around about the 200th best album ever. I think it's his best piece of work, though a number of his albums are brilliant. It's got a very sort of folksy, spiritual sort of feel to it. The interesting thing about the album is that Stevens was an art student, and this is one of his pieces of art. He actually designed the album cover himself. It's a beautiful album, a really beautiful album. Again, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here is from the 1970s, but if this music didn't exist, then the stuff that follows doesn't exist. These bands, these musicians, these songwriters were blazing a trail that left us with this sort of catalogue of incredibly important but beautifully iconic albums at the same time. Cat Stevens, for me, definitely one of the the genius singer-songwriters of a generation, and still recording. Take ourselves a bit further forward now to 1988, and bursting onto the scene, I guess, was a black female artist in America called Tracy Chapman. I say burst onto the scene because I think she created, this is her first album, it's just called Tracy Chapman. It's a body of work. It's a really short album. It's barely 30 minutes long. But I think it was genuinely something that hadn't been heard before, and I still think her second album called Crossroads, equally as good as this, but didn't quite get the same degree of exposure or critical acclaim that this got. But Chapman sort of, I don't know, this album is all about the social conscience and social injustice. Touches some difficult subjects. There's a song on the album which picks up on the issue of domestic violence. There's a lot about racial and gender inequality in the album, about the hardships of poverty in the US, which were important sort of statements being made. Tracy Chapman breakthrough was that she stepped in at the very last minute for the Nelson Mandela 70th birthday tribute concert when Stevie Wonder wasn't able to perform. She stepped in and performed one of the tracks off the album, Fast Car, and the rest is history. But I actually think this is for me one of its type, solo singer-songwriter, largely performing most of the music herself. I think it's one of the world's great albums, and I love the fact that I now own an original copy of the album as well. This album, Counting Crows, August and Everything After, this was the Crows' first album from 1993. And it's funny, sometimes you can explicitly remember where you were the very first time you heard this. Now, I was in the back of a friend's car on a hot, late summer evening on our way to Peterborough to watch Aston Villa play a League Cup game. And he stuck this, I think it was a CD, but it could have been a tape, obviously, back then, on and said, like, have you heard this? And of course, none of us had heard this. And I still think that this typifies bands whose first album is so good that they probably then struggle to produce something as good again, even though their follow-up music is brilliant. This album, I think, marks the Crows out as something quite extraordinary, really. The theme of the album is lost love, unrequited love, that sort of thing. It's got a sort of a sort of a folksy sadness about it. But the interesting thing about this, again, from what I was saying a bit earlier about understanding the music that influences musicians, this album for the Adam Duritz, the lead singer of Counting Crows, spent his entire childhood listening to Bob Dylan and Van Morrison. And I think when you sit down and you put this album on, particularly some of the tracks, you can really feel that coming through. It's a beautiful album. The album cover is actually the lyrics to the song August and Everything After, which rather bizarrely the band never then included on the album. And I think it was only literally a couple of years ago that they released August and Everything After as a single. But though the lyrics to the song are on the album cover, the song doesn't appear on the album. But I would hold this as one of the most dear and important albums in my life. It covers a period of my life that, was, that bit, I guess, that transition from being a young adult to an older adult. And it sums up everything about the 90s for me, really. So I love this album. I could have picked so many. And I've left some absolutely brilliant albums that I was looking through the collection earlier to pick out a few albums to talk about, and so many I've left behind, which I could, we could do hours and hours of these sorts of things. But I've chosen as my next album Exodus by Bob Marley and the Wailers, 1977. I think generally considered to be the most important reggae album of all time. And it was voted by the Billboard magazine readers as the most important album of the 20th century in terms of its message. Marley was a very spiritual person, often quoted the Bible, and Exodus therefore is not unsurprising. The album really is about social injustice again, and political injustice, which was very, very significant part of Jamaican life in the mid-70s. Marley himself and his wife Rita, of course, was shot. They were about to perform at a political rally for the then Prime Minister, and they were shot and badly injured. Marley then moved to London, brought his family to London, where Exodus was recorded. And the Exodus album probably has five big hits came off this album, and probably some of the most well-known of Marley's songs, really. Exodus, Jammin', Waiting in Vain, Three Little Birds, One Love, all came off this album. It's a beautiful album. So many of Marley's albums were, but I actually think that this probably was his most sort of spiritual and political album. And again, a musician that was taken from us far too early. I think most of you probably caught on that over the last sort of 30 odd sessions of Music Tuesday, I've talked about this artist, Bruce Springsteen, a lot. This is Springsteen's second album, which came out in the same year as his first album. This came out in 1973. Bruce Springsteen, The Wild, The Innocent and The E Street Shuffle, which the E Street Band are obviously Springsteen's backing band. This is I would describe this as the album that set the scene for everything Springsteen has done since. And it's not probably in the sense of the sort of general view of his work the most popular of his albums, but I think this album's really raucous, and it's really it's Bruce Springsteen at his rawest, his most sort of ambitious songwriting. I think this is the point where I think people had to stop saying, he's just a Bob Dylan wannabe. It's a fantastic album. It really is one of those albums that when you put it on, you literally become absorbed into the sort of content, what it was that Springsteen was was talking about. And of course, a lot of Bruce Springsteen's music is about the sort of experience and the life of blue collar workers in the US. And the interesting about this album, it was make or break. Springsteen's career, his record company, it was, they didn't think it was going anywhere. And this really was the sort of game changer. But interestingly, it didn't come into the UK charts until the release of the Born to Run album, which was probably at that point Springsteen's most commercially successful album, and people started to listen to his back catalogue. And I think this is where the Wild, the Innocent and the E Street Shuffle really said to people, do you know what, this guy is a brilliant singer-songwriter in his own self, really. I think I'm quite an eclectic. I'm hoping that you're getting a sense from these albums that I listen to quite a broad spectrum of music. But I have to say, back in the late 70s, when I was a teenager, finding my way, if you like, in terms of listening to music, one band really did sit at the heart of the stuff that I used to love to stick on, turn the volume up, annoy the life out of my parents, probably annoy the life out of the neighbourhood, really. And I've chosen Deep Purple's Machine Head. Machine Head's it is the album that set the direction of travel for heavy metal music, particularly in the UK. Came out in 1971. Again, I first heard it probably 77, 78. Never heard anything like it really in real terms. I think it's a brilliantly iconic album, and for no other reason. I guess a lot of people have heard Deep Purple's Smoke on the Water. Smoke on the Water's on the album, but Smoke on the Water actually tells the story of the history of the LP. They've been touring endlessly. They wanted an album that reflected the amazing noise and energy of their stage performances, and so for tax reasons they went off to Switzerland to a place called Montreux, where they were going to record this album in a building called the Montreux Casino. And they'd hired the Rolling Stones mobile recording studio at great cost, which in those days to ship all of that stuff out was hugely expensive. And literally the afternoon before the album was due to be recorded, or the start recorded, a band called Frank Zappa and the Mummers did a live show at the Montreux Casino, and some rather exuberant stage pyrotechnics, fireworks, set fire to the building and burnt it to the ground, which if you listen to Smoke on the Water, the whole story of the casino burning and everything like that, and that left the band in a really bad place, in terms of they were out in Switzerland, they'd spent all their money to get there and to get all the recording, and then they now didn't have anywhere to record it. So they managed to find themselves an empty, derelict hotel called the Grand Hotel. No heating, no lighting, so the whole band, its production crew, moved in, and the rest is history. They recorded Machine Head through the winter of 1971, and it's a brilliant album. I know that heavy metal isn't necessarily everybody's cup of tea, but sometimes you need to sit down and open your mind and just listen to something and say, do you know what, that is incredible. And I do think Machine Head's one of those incredible albums. Another big sort of area, I suppose generically it's called prog rock. But again, for me, this 1973 Genesis album, Selling England by the Pound. I think it's a massively important album. It's a great body of work, but I think the importance of this album is it marks a transition, I think, in British prog rock, particularly for Genesis at the time, led by Peter Gabriel, where they were moving into a much more sort of jazz rock, pop orientated style. This is a very nostalgic album for Genesis in a sense. It looks back to classic English themes and lots of sort of symbolism in the album. I guess you'd call it as quite surreal, but I think Peter Gabriel's time with the band was beginning to come to an end, and The interesting thing about this album is, I think, here we are in 2021. The album was produced at a time when, and this is going to sound very familiar to people, a Conservative government had lost control of the sort of political arena in the UK. The economy was shambolic, inflation was raging. We'd only recently joined the EU, and there was a big conversation about whether or not we should be leaving the EU. This is 1973, remember, not 2020. This was, I think, an attempt to sort of look back at a glorious past. But it's another very iconic album cover. I guess for me, there's lots of great tracks on the album, but I guess I Know What I Like and The Cinema Show would be the standout tracks on here. But a very, very important album, both in the history of Genesis as a band, but I think also in the tradition of UK prog rock. And again, another one from the 70s, but hugely influential in what came after. I'm going to finish this session by talking about an extraordinary album. Had a massive impact on me when it was released. It was released in 1979, and there's so much about this album. It's a double album by the band The Clash, London Calling, a hugely iconic double album. And I think what for me this album was about was the band moving away from its traditional sort of punk rock roots into becoming a really important rock band. And I think when you put this album on, you can really sense the band's determination, if you like, to break its historical punk roots. And the band experiment with quite a few different styles of music on this album. A lot of the musical world, again, the music newspapers, the magazines and that, actually voted this as the greatest album of all time. I'm not sure it's that. It is a great album. It's an important album. There's a lot of interesting things about the album cover. A lot of LPs, the album cover was almost as important as the actual music. But this one's quite interesting. The iconic, particularly the pink, that's paying homage to Elvis Presley's debut album, where pink was used on the album cover, and The Clash used that to sort of pay homage to Elvis Presley. Again, when you look back in the history of these bands, the musicians, who they were listening to when they were kids, young men, before they started writing their own music. And the album cover itself, the record company tried right to the last minute to refuse to use this image of the guitarist from the band, bass guitarist, smashing his guitar. Paul Zimmerman was the guy's name, but everybody's idea was that he was copying The Who, and had got so sort of, I don't know, agitated in the live performance, and so that he smashed his guitar. Actually, he smashed the guitar because from the stage he could see the way that the security and the bouncers were treating the members of the audience who were standing up and simply wanting to sort of dance and get involved in the music. They were being assaulted by the security and the bouncers. Photograph was taken at the New York Palladium when the band were on tour in New York the year before. It's quite an extraordinary, powerful, hugely iconic image. But the reason that the record company didn't want to use the cover was it's not in focus. And they thought that it diminished from the album. But the band themselves, they actually said it's the greatest photograph ever taken of them. And there are some great photographs of the Clash in action. But I love that. So 1979, The Clash, London Calling, that's the final album that I'm going to talk about today. I could talk about so many, so many other bands have influenced my musical tastes over the years, but those, I've just picked them out because I've listened to them a lot over lockdown. So where are we? Tonight we're going to start the first of this year's Keeping in Touch Music Tuesdays. I'm going to do them every couple of weeks from now on, because we want to bring some new content and some new shows to this year. Obviously we're going to be in lockdown for at least another 3 or 4 months, Things are very difficult. So I'm hoping that Music Tuesdays will carry on being great fun. I shall see everybody this evening at 7 o'clock and we'll go from there. But thanks very much for listening to me rambling on about my favourite music. I might do this again in a few months' time and talk about some other albums that I've not included in today's episode really. But take care and I'll see you all tonight at 7 o'clock.